huh?
Welcome. My name is Beth Grimes, and I'm the regent of the Malibu chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. I'm going to give you just a little description about us, and then I'll introduce our speakers and the event we so look forward to. The National Society Daughters of the American Revolution is a nonprofit, non-political, volunteer women's service organization dedicated to promoting patriotism, preserving American history, and securing America's future through better education for children. Members are all lineal descendants of those who supported the cause of independence in the Revolutionary War. And we're all gathered together today to listen to June Aochi Berk and Susan Kamei speak to us about an episode in American history that, as I have recently learned, many people know nothing about, which I find very difficult to understand. But pursuant to presidential order during World War II, Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated from their homes and incarcerated after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And June Aochi Berk was one of the incarcerated Japanese Americans, and she's here to speak to us about her experiences and what she did with her life after she grew up. June was born on October 17, 1932, and she told me that, so I think that means I'm authorized to let you know. She was born in Los Angeles in the Hollywood district. She was evacuated from her home and sent to camp from 1942 to 1945. Initially she was sent to the Santa Anita Racetrack Assembly Center, and from there her family was sent to Roar, Arkansas. She was released from camp in 1945. She received $25 and a free one-way train ticket to Denver, Colorado. At present, she's a volunteer. She's a legacy project director for the Tuna Canyon Detention Center Coalition. Detention Station Coalition, I'm going to say that again. Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition, 1916. Is that right? 1916? Maybe that was a typo. Anyway, she's involved with interviewing descendants of the Tuna Canyon detainees, Japanese American detainees. Funded by the National Park Service Japanese Confinement Sites Grant. And Susan Kamei is the author of the award-winning book, When Can We Go Back to America? Voices of Japanese American Incarceration During World War II. Simon & Schuster, 2021. She's recognized as a leading scholar and educator on our country's unjustified wartime imprisonment of more than 125,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, solely on the basis of their race. A descendant of incarcerees, she was a volunteer attorney in the legislative campaign that resulted in the successful passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, providing an official apology for our government's wrongful wartime actions and token redress payments, as mentioned above, to the incarcerated survivors. So with that, I will turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, Beth. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor and a delight for June and myself to get to be here with you all. June is the real celebrity. You should have heard the applause and the hugs when she arrived. It's been a lot of fun to work with her to prepare this presentation. And she's told me that she's been referred to as a Forrest Gump because she's been present at so many important parts of history. So we're going to share some of those Forrest Gump moments. She has so many. But I think over the next hour, what I hope you'll take away is that these are not just Japanese American stories or even Asian American stories. These are American stories. And so, June, it occurs to me that what you and I might actually have in common with the Daughters of American Revolution is that we all have immigrants in our family history. And what we also have in our American history is that immigration and naturalization have been a very contested topic throughout our country's history. This is a political cartoon from 1790. It shows two congressmen on the floor of what was then the embryonic House of Representatives, and they're actually fighting during a debate of what would become the Naturalization Act that was passed that year. Anyone here a descendant of John Adams? Oh, great, there's someone that is. Well, as our second president, he and the Federalist Party passed a series of alien and sedition acts that restricted immigration and the ability of immigrants to become naturalized citizens. So who were the so-called enemies that our founding fathers and mothers wanted to keep out of our new country? Any guesses? Yeah, the Irish, and first the French. Okay, so this is another political cartoon of the time. The French depicted as a five-headed monster. And so Katie mentioned Irish. Also, anyone German ancestry? Yeah, a few more. So as subsequent waves of the immigrants that came from Europe arrived, they in turn faced intense discrimination, and especially the Germans during World War I. But the difference is that those that came from Europe were classified or considered to be Caucasian or white. And those that came across the Pacific were not, and therefore ineligible for citizenship. So under that Naturalization Act that I just mentioned of 1790, only a free white person could become a naturalized citizen. And under a pair of Supreme Court decisions in 1922, Japanese and other Asian Americans were deemed not to be white. So for those of us that had ancestors that came across the Pacific instead of the Atlantic, our American experience has been quite different. And so to warm us up for June's story and how her family and my family came to the United States, the Japanese immigration story really starts with the Chinese immigration story. You might have heard about the Chinese railroad workers on the Continental Railroad, but did you know what brought them here from rural China? The merchants, robber barons of the railroads, and other captains of industries sent labor brokers to China to lure young men, and these were really teenagers, boys, as cheap labor. So a step up from slavery, but they came under labor contracts and they were indentured. They were willing to do hazardous work and live under very hostile and dangerous situations. They were the force that, in addition to building the railroad, were the field workers in the plantations in the territory of Hawaii for coffee, sugarcane, and pineapples. As a backlash to the presence of the wave of Chinese immigration, you might have heard of the yellow peril phenomenon. This came about because of what has become a pattern of allocating or identifying with the immigrants' economic issues or labor issues. And they promoted fear-mongering messages that characterized the Chinese as treacherous, sinister, heathen, immoral, and worse. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was politically very popular, and this act shut down immigration from China for 70 years. So now there's a labor void in the railroads and in those plantations. So where did those labor brokers go next? They went to Meiji-era Japan. At this time, Japan was suffering its own economic crisis. Inflation, and the government, the new government, the Tokugawa regime, imposed severe taxes on the farms, which devastated the farmers. So if you weren't a number one son and in a position to inherit your family enterprise or farm, then you got apprenticed out or you had to find something else to do with your life. And so, lured by those same tales of fame and fortune in the United States, the labor brokers brought thousands of young Japanese men, including my great-grandparents and great-grandfathers and grandfather, and Jews. So this is a photo of the Japanese railroad workers. And June, now your father is going to enter this story. Do you have you have a great story about him working on the railroads?
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having us here. And yes, my father came to America in 1899 when he was 20 years old. He had heard stories in Japan that the streets in California were lined with gold, and he wanted to be a part of that, so he came over and he worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, excuse me, building tracks from Montana, Idaho to Washington. He worked on the railroad tracks for about 2 years, and I think he had enough. So he went to work at a hotel in Seattle, Washington. And from there he migrated down to Los Angeles and Hollywood, California, where he had a Japanese Day Workers Employment Agency, and he was a gardener, excuse me, one of the first gardeners to be on Hollywood Boulevard. They would go from door to door, ring the doorbells, and say, "I cut your lawn for 50 cents. They would cut the lawn, and then they would have to take their lawnmowers back to the hotel because they didn't have a truck yet. And then they would pick up the wheelbarrow and then take the wheelbarrow down Hollywood Boulevard and pick up all the cuttings that they cut the grass." And so he says, that's the start of gardening in Hollywood. So,
I'm going to show a photo here in a minute, okay?
okay.
Okay, so now in the backdrop, that prejudice that the Chinese faced is now being applied to all the Japanese immigrants. And as June was mentioning, her parents and my grandparents, known as the Issei, or first generation, became entrepreneurs. They set up restaurants and boarding houses. They set up canneries and were fishermen, set up their own fishing fleets. And then they faced their own political backlash with the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement. And this agreement stopped any further immigration from Japan of laborers. Now the difference with the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907 is that there were exceptions, and it still permitted the immigration of anyone who was not considered a laborer from Japan. So women could come that were going to come as picture brides, students, merchants, ministers. Okay? And the advent, though, of World War I, the relationship with Japan was becoming increasingly tense as Japan became a more politically and militarily aggressive country. And labor unions, white supremacist groups, such as the Native Sons and Daughters of the American West, and a very powerful agribusiness lobby started campaigns that lasted for decades against the Japanese. So we're going to loop back to the 1920s and the 1930s, but the backdrop for the Japanese American families is that California and other states started enacting laws that prevented aliens from owning land or having a long-term lease, which is defined as 3 years or more. And so this kind of politics is now building against the Japanese to the 1924 Immigration Act that stopped any further immigration of anybody from Japan that would last until the 1952 Walter McCarran Immigration and Nationalities Act. So what June's parents and my grandparents had to do was, as aliens, who could not become US citizens even if they wanted to, had to maintain a registration with the US government. So this is a card for June's father. So this is a beautiful photo. Now, June, your mother came here from Japan, 1924, just before the immigration ban. How did she come to know your father? And I think there's some stories here. Is that working all right?
Yeah. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
My mother was my father's fourth wife. His first wife died, and so he went back to Japan to get his second wife, and maybe it's the other way around, I'm sorry. The first wife was divorced. He went back to Japan to get the second wife. Let's try this again.
Is that comfortable? You want to try it?
Hi.
Does that
Okay,
sound
and his second wife died, so in Japan, if a wife should die, they send the sister over. So they sent her sister over, and then she died too, but left him a son that was 2 years old. So he went back to Japan and found my mother, who said she would take care of his 2-year-old son and be his wife. So she came over in 1924, just before they closed the door to immigration of all Japanese. And they had 5 more children. My first brother died from pneumonia because back in those days, Japanese could not be admitted to hospitals. And he died from pneumonia. My oldest brother then was my sister was born in 24, sorry. And my brother was born in 1926, and I came along in 1932, right in the middle of the Depression, and probably shocked them all.
So this is a photo of your neighborhood, yeah?
Yes, my father had his business on Sunset and Vine in a building which now has the Van Gogh immersive exhibit. And I went in there and I looked around the building. I mean, well, this is a brand new building now, but my father's original hotel building is no longer there naturally. But he had also a pool hall right across the street on Coanga. And there was a small community of Japanese businesses there, a dry cleaning store, a grocery store, a boarding house. And that was probably the first settlement in Los Angeles on the west side of town. Then they eventually, the businesses started developing in Little Tokyo downtown because that was where they were allowed to buy businesses, and Little Tokyo grew. So, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so your father had many talents.
Okay, my father and my mother, I think, were frustrated kabuki actors, and my father taught the song where you sing the whole kabuki play as the actors would act on the stage. And I had a love of Japanese dancing from the time I was a little child, and I always carried a kimono around with me, so that people would ask me to dance, and I go, oh, okay. I would dance for them. And eventually my mother was able to get me into a dance school, the Fujima Kansuma, and my dance teacher just died last year at 104. And she was amazing.
She is the premier Odori dance teacher.
Yes. And I had the privilege of learning under her. We danced at the Hollywood Bowl before the war, and we danced at what we call the Yamato Hall. It was in Little Tokyo. It was a 400-seat theater on a 3-story building, and I heard, I don't know, I didn't see, they said there was gambling on the top floor, the theater on the second floor, and business on the first floor.
They didn't let you upstairs, did they?
Pardon me?
They wouldn't let you upstairs, did they?
No, I didn't see any gambling. I didn't see. We were busy running around backstage and getting into trouble. So
And I
let's put.
think you're this one, yeah? Fourth from the left?
Yes, I'm the fourth from left there.
And then you're here?
Yeah, right there at Hollywood Bowl. That's my teacher right in behind me.
And that's Fujima Kansuma. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's me dancing in camp. That's the story of, they call it Tabigasa Dochu. It's the story of an itinerant gambler, an ex-samurai, who wanders around the country gambling, and his girlfriend is looking for him. She finds him, and she's trying to talk him into coming home and marrying her and giving up his gambling ways. That's the story, and it's set to beautiful music. And I danced that so much in camp that one day I had a fit, and I said, I'm sick and tired of dancing this stupid dance. And so they let me cry and have my fit, and then they said, okay, now go up on stage and dance. I said, okay.
So that's actually going to bring us up to the war. And the declaration of war in 1941 gave that coalition that I was telling you about of agriculture, labor, defense, and nativist groups the opportunity. They wanted to remove the Japanese Americans that they thought were un-American. And I think we see over and over again in our country's history identifying our psychological need to identify someone as an enemy or to blame them for what we don't like or fear. So I mentioned this context because Pearl Harbor did not actually create the prejudice against Japanese person, but rather I describe it as it lit the powder keg that was already existing. And so people are surprised to find out that it just wasn't a matter of wartime hysteria that led to the political forces to remove and detain persons who now have the ancestry of a declared enemy. And this next set of slides I'm going to show you is relevant to something that June's doing now, and that's that the FBI and the Army had pre-identified community leaders to arrest the first generation Issei men because they anticipated the war from Japan. Now, the Census Bureau has since acknowledged that it broke its confidentiality principles and policies to share the data with the Army and the FBI to know where the Japanese American families lived. But by nightfall from Pearl Harbor, of the Pearl Harbor bombing day, more than 2,000 Japanese American Issei men had been arrested. And some of them were taken to this facility, which is called Tuna Canyon, and it is located in Tahunga, just off the 210. And the Department of Justice converted this, it was an abandoned civilian conservation camp, and temporarily used it to detain those that were considered enemy aliens. These are men across the country. So, June, you're going to tell us more later about the work that you're doing, but how did you get involved with the Tuna Canyon?
I heard about Tuna Canyon. I couldn't believe that this happened right here in the city of Los Angeles. It was an article in the LA Times. But I want to tell you that it was not only Japanese immigrants who were arrested, there were German, Italian, also in that camp arrested, and some overflowed into Griffith Park. And we just had a sign unveiled at Griffith Park where some of these men were held. And they even kidnapped South Americans from Costa Rica, Germans from Costa Rica, Japanese from Peru, and with the order from the president, by presidential order, they were brought up to the United States, and then as their passports were confiscated, they became illegal immigrants and were put in places like Tuna Canyon and also inland places like Crystal City.
So we're doing a little adjustment here. So the difference is that there was no political pressure or call to incarcerate on a mass scale Italians and Germans. And when I mentioned the difference in the ability to become citizens is because by this point there were something like 6 million German citizens in the United States. So there were just one too many, and also they were a political voting constituency. So while we're fixing that, I'll keep going. That on the night of Pearl Harbor, 2 FBI agents. I'm going to interject a story of my own here. 2 FBI agents came to the door of my father's home and went through the house, and this was without search warrants. And although he was not a community leader and wasn't arrested, this was the first show of force by the U.S. government. And very quickly, the animosity and expressions of hatred targeted against anyone who was perceived to be associated with Japan, now assumed to be wholesale saboteurs and capable of committing espionage, and therefore should be suspected to be disloyal to the interests of the U.S. Now keep in mind, June and her generation, my parents' generation, known as the Nisei, were American-born citizens and knew nothing except being American. So just in the 10 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the political pressure snowballed until February 1942, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which gave the military the power to remove Japanese American families from a designated zone, which was essentially the West Coast, from Washington, Oregon, California, into part of Arizona, and gave the military the power to transport them into detention. and the Department of Justice and its agency head, the Attorney General, and the rest of the Roosevelt administration caved on any objections, constitutional and otherwise. And this is the exclusion order that affected June's family on the right. So what I have heard, and what I'm sure June has heard, is so often said, well, you have to understand, we were at war. But really what they're saying, and if they were unfiltered enough or honest enough to say what they were really thinking, which is we were at war with you people, falling into the trap of guilt by ancestry. So remember I mentioned yellow peril? Well, those exclusion orders refer to aliens and non-aliens. So let me ask you, what's a non-alien? Katie, what's a non-alien? Yeah, a citizen, somebody who's born here. So the government would use these terms purposefully to hide the fact or to blur the distinction between the rights of those who were citizens and not. And so the military orders instructed a family representative to report to whether it was a school or a library, someplace in the community, and they had to register their family. And they were told to report to transportation for so-called evacuation on a particular day to an unknown location. They did not know where they were being sent. So the family representative was given these tags that looked like luggage tags or mailing tags, and they were issued a family number. So now instead of being known by your family's last name, you were going to be known by this number. So today, these tags are considered to be symbolic of this dehumanizing process that we're going to tell you more about in terms of the whole incarceration experience and its aftermath. June, do you remember your family number?
Yes, 3307.
So everybody always remembers, right? And the instructions said that you could only take what you could carry. Okay, so usually that meant a suitcase in each hand or some bundle. You didn't know where you were going. You didn't know what the conditions were going to be like wherever you were going to end up. You didn't know how long you were going to be there and whether you were even going to come back. So, June, how old were you when the exclusion order took effect, and what did you take, or what did your mother help you pack?
I was 10 years old, and we were walking home from the movie theater. We had just seen the Anna Durbin movie, and coming home on the telephone post were these signs of all Japanese have to evacuate from this area. And my sister says, that's impossible. I'm an American citizen, and I just studied civil rights, and I know my rights. They can't do this to us. And she was really adamant about refusing to go to camp. But my mother said, if you don't go to camp, who's going to take care of us? And who's going to take care of you if you stay outside? So she said, okay, she'll go to camp with us. So, right after the war, the next day after December 7th, when the bombing happened, federal, state, county, city workers were all fired on the spot. Motion picture industry people, Japanese Americans, were fired on the spot. And there was also a ban. You couldn't travel more than 5 miles from your home. So my father, being a gardener and his clients being in Beverly Hills, he couldn't go there. So most people just had to quit working or couldn't go to work, couldn't even visit somebody in the hospital. So you had to stay within the 5-mile radius of your home. And then we had to get ready to pack. So, and then we heard rumors of people being arrested. So they said, burn everything that you have that's Japanese. So we had bonfires in our backyard where we burned pictures and chinaware, photographs, books, anything written in Japanese. People had bonfires in their backyards, and you could see the smoke from all these bonfires. And as fathers were being arrested, my father had his bag packed, ready to go, but fortunately nobody came after him. I think he was kind of disappointed that he wasn't important enough to be taken away. So, but our postman said he'll take care of our property, what we couldn't sell. So many friends came by to help different neighbors. And I remember the black family, God, I can't remember the name right now, who took care of so many people's properties and belongings, and made breakfast for people going to the camp and visiting the people, their friends and people in camp by bringing them pies and cookies. We had so many people step up and be kind with us that, pardon? No, not now. So we, there were missionaries, there were Christian missionaries who, Quaker organizations who stepped up, and you could read about Herbert Nicholson, who visited the people in Tuna Canyon and would bring messages from them written in Japanese to the families and take clothing back to the Canyon. And the American Baptist Association, even the Methodist churches, the Baptist churches, Methodist church, even the Presbyterian churches, all had people who helped and tried to help and visited the camps. The American Quaker Association helped high school students wanting to go to college. They sponsored them to move out of camp, and so my sister was able to go to St. Paul, Minnesota to attend a beauty school. My brother was able to go to Chicago to get a job. So because of Quaker families saying, we will take care of you financially. So there were very many kindnesses. And I remember in camp, all of us kids got boxes of Christmas presents. And I said, where did these Christmas presents come from? And they said, oh, some Quaker organization outside of camp sent Christmas presents to all of you. And I thought, there's people outside who think about us, and I was so shocked. I think that memory stays with me as the kindnesses of people.
Let's talk about you going to Santa Anita.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So my mother was just a little older than you, and she and her parents also boarded the buses as you and your family did, which was right at First and Central in Little Tokyo, now the site of the Japanese American National Museum. Oh, and I should mention that as June was telling the story of her sister, that Congress passed a law that made it a crime not to obey these exclusion orders. So that was something that I did not realize when I was growing up, and I asked my mother, well, why did you go along with this? And she said, well, the soldiers had guns and they were pointed at us. So the Army converted other camps, such as fairgrounds at Puyallup, and 2 horse tracks at Tanforan and Santa Anita. And they euphemistically call these assembly centers. So this is the plot plan for the Santa Anita Assembly Center. This is in the Huntington collection, and here's a photo of what it looked like with the barracks. So, June, you and your family arrived. There was barbed wire perimeter, 24-hour armed guards in towers, searchlights, unannounced searches, twice daily roll calls, metal cots without mattresses, sacks that you stuff straw into, and a horse stall in Barn 52 was your home from May to September 1942. And what was it like to live in these conditions? And you visited the barn a few years ago.
Yes, when I visited our horse stall, I couldn't believe how small it was that 5 of us fit into this small stall. We were given a white pillowcase, and we were told to fill it with straw and we had to drag it to our horse stall, and that's what we slept on. I remember one thing very strongly. Even as we boarded the buses, my mother wore her best fur collared coat. My father wore his hat. Everybody was dressed up. They had this feeling, and so strong, that we will not frighten the children. They did everything they could not to show us any emotion, any crying. There's this saying in Japanese, makenaide. Makenaide means you never give up your dignity. You never show you are defeated. And that's what our parents, my parents especially, and the people that I remember seeing around the bus stations, never crying, never yelling, never screaming. Everybody was dressed up like they were going on a Sunday church service, and boarded the buses. We didn't know where we were going, and I didn't have any military personnel behind me or around surrounding me. I thought this was a big adventure, and my mother and father and my sister and my brother all encouraged me to not be scared. And I think, I don't know how they felt, but they said, for the sake of the children, you have to be strong. And so they were. And they never showed me, my parents, my brothers and my sisters, never showed me any fear, any unhappiness, never crying in front of me. So I don't know if they did while they were by themselves, but to us children, they said, for the sake of the children, you're going to stay strong.
So then you were moved again to Arkansas. And this is a map that shows the 10, they're so-called camps that were established under the jurisdiction of a temporary agency that was known as the War Relocation Authority, so WRA. And I'm going to show, there's a series of slides here. I think it's remarkable for a family to have these photos of June's family's life at Rower, Arkansas. Your barrack and the mess hall. The flooding, I mean, the weather was terrible, right? It was swampy. I've heard stories of mosquitoes and snakes in the water. June was just mentioning the phrase, for the sake of the children. And so one of the first things that the Issei parents did for the Nisei children and teenagers was to establish a whole series of activities and create as much of a normal life as possible. June, do you want to describe what's on the right, the pin?
Yes, that was made out of a peach seed. We would take watermelon seeds, and after we eat the watermelons, we would spit the seeds out. And then we would wash the seeds and let it dry, and then we would string it with a needle and thread and make necklaces out of our watermelon seeds and cantaloupe seeds. We would paint it with our nail polish. We would look at catalogs, Sears Roebuck catalogs. That was our window to the outside world. This was the way we connected with the outside world. We could look at pictures of what people were wearing, what shoes they were wearing, and wishing that we could have a dress or a coat or a dish or a towel like that. And this Disney animator, Willie Ito, says that was the window to his outside world. And yes, that's what we did. We looked at the Sears catalog daily to see what life was like outside.
This is a very special photo. June, you want to tell us about what you're doing here?
Yes, the government wouldn't allow any Japanese language school in camps, but they said to keep the older people happy, the Issei's happy, that we could dance for them, we could perform, we could do Japanese dancing. So I had a teacher who taught Japanese dancing. Kansuma was one of them too. But this one here is, the mothers all made the flowers that hang from the ceiling. The fathers all painted the backdrops of the stage. And the mothers worked on the costumes. This was built in a new gymnasium and auditorium in rural Arkansas just before we left, and we had this show, and I was a singer and I was playing the shamisen, and my girlfriend Takayo, who to this day we still call each other every day, and been friends from the time we were 10 years old, and we grew up together doing dancing like this.
And you were also allowed to go to Jerome in order to dance? We performed in other camps like Jerome, Arkansas, and the costume that I'm wearing, the kimono that I'm wearing, the orange one, I just found that kimono about 3 weeks ago. And I didn't realize my mother had packed all my kimonos in one of the suitcases, I guess. I had about 5, and this is one of them. And this was at the bottom of my suitcase, and it shocked me when I saw it. I said, "Oh, that's the same kimono that I wore in that photograph, dancing in Jerome." So it was a really nice surprise and shock to me to find it. My mother also made another kimono for me that's at the Japanese American National Museum. She ordered the material from Sears Roebuck catalog, and she would stay up all night sewing by hand a kimono like this, but only that was purple and white checkered kimono. But I guess my mother packed these kimonos in one of the suitcases. You can only carry 2 suitcases a piece, and I had to have my majorette white boots. I'm not going to wear those ugly brown boots that everybody else is wearing. And she bought me a blouse and a pretty top and a skirt. And my mother must have packed these precious kimonos in her suitcases. I didn't know that. And I knew that I had a suitcase of kimonos, but I was so shocked to find this one. So it was really a nice surprise. So you hang on to that. We're going to come back to that. So your brother Tom was, we're going to talk about this really quickly, was in the very famous 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And what I'd like you to take away from Tom's experience is that here are a group of young men who volunteered from behind barbed wire. They were considered disloyal enough to their country to need to be imprisoned, but wanted to prove their loyalty by volunteering to serve when that was allowed. And then later, thousands more were drafted from the camps. And to this day, the 442nd and the 100th Battalion still remain the most decorated military unit in all of U.S. military history for its size and length of service. And they also served in the Pacific in the Military Intelligence Service. So even though FDR, the FDR would not let the Japanese Americans out of the camps into 1944, even though the war was, by all experts and his own cabinet, was coming to an end. But he refused to consider releasing them until he had won his fourth election, which was an unprecedented election. So June, when your family had the ability to, to leave camp, you mentioned already that you got $25 in the train ticket and you went to Denver.
Yeah. That's my, the last scene leaving camp, looking out from the back of the truck. There was such poverty in the South, I remember, and there was such prejudice still against, they were then called colored, African American black people, that that was the one thing that we learned while we were in the South, that we didn't have in California, and I just couldn't understand it. And my father, being an enemy alien, when he came out of the camp one day to go shopping in McGee, Arkansas, and Little Rock, he was told he cannot sit with the colored people. He had to sit with the white people, and he had to use the white fountain, and he had to use the white restrooms. And my brother couldn't go upstairs to smoke because that was a black section for the colored only, but he cannot go up there. And my father found it incredulous that here he is, an enemy alien, behind prison bars, locked up, with a barbed wire fence around us, and guard towers looking down on us, that he, in the South, is considered white and not colored. He couldn't get over that. I think that's what I remember about the South.
So when you got to Denver, you and I share a special relationship with someone, and that's Min Yasui. Min is known for being one of the three that defied the military exclusion order and become a test case to the Supreme Court that would challenge the constitutionality of the various stages of the incarceration that the Supreme Court held was justified in 1944. And so the June here on the right, and she worked for Min after she graduated from high school, and he remained a civil rights leader and an advocate his entire life. And he's shown here, you might have heard of the Korematsu case. So he's shown here with Fred Korematsu and Goran Hirabayashi. And June was one of the organizers of a very lovely tribute to Min in 2016. And I just was very grateful that he was a mentor of mine too. So you moved back to Los Angeles in 1953, and you hadn't been here in LA very long when you were approached about being a candidate for the Nisei Week pageant in 1954. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the Nisei Week. It's a very important celebration in the Japanese American community. It was started in the 1930s in the midst of the Depression to try to bring business to Little Tokyo. And an important part of it is the opening and closing parades and the crowning of a Nisei Week queen. And so then and now, being a Nisei Week queen is really an ambassador on behalf of the community. And here is June as one of the candidates. And so it's how they got selected was a little different than now. So how did you make the court?
Well, back in 1954, I had just moved here. My father had just died, and my mother was in the hospital, City of Hope, with cancer. And my mother said, "You're not going to ever win that contest. We don't have any money." So, that year, every time you made a purchase in Little Tokyo, you got a ticket for one vote. Mm-hmm. So it tried to encourage people to go to Little Tokyo to shop and buy refrigerators and stoves and big items, so that then if you ate a meal, you still got $1 ticket for every dollar you spent. So every week they kept a tally of how many votes each girl was getting, and the top 5 would become the court. So I was always about running the 6th, and then at the final count, I edged in on the 5th. And then
She was a dark horse.
yeah, that's what they called me in the newspaper, the dark horse. And then we were judged, and I knew how to do Japanese dancing. I think that sort of swayed the judges, that I knew how to do Japanese dancing and spoke Japanese. So when I was crowned queen at the Palladium, there were 5,000 people in the Palladium ballroom on, was it Hollywood or
Yeah.
Boulevard?
So this became the start of a modeling career.
Wow.
You know, it's beautiful.
That was when, back then, I had a waist.
So I'm going to leap ahead to some more recent times. And for me, June is such a treasure because she's willing to talk about these stories, because so many of the Nisei were not. Okay? It was a function of the shame and the anger, the reaction that they got when people would tell them, oh, well, it was justified and everybody had to do their part during the war. But in the 1970s and 80s, our community became successful in the campaign that we call redress. And this term comes from a phrase in the First Amendment that says we as citizens have the right to petition our government for redress of grievances. And so, as Beth mentioned in the introduction, I was able to be part of this legislative campaign that was successful in the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1998, signed here by President Reagan, that gave an official apology and identified through a Federal Commission report a larger set of reasons for the motivations behind the incarceration. So many of the incarcerees donated their redress checks in order to found the Japanese American National Museum. And in another one of her series of Forrest Gump moments, June has been a key staff member, volunteer, and all-around resource for the museum for over 30 years. So I'm just going to highlight, as we wrap up this portion, 3 major projects. There's so many, but just 3 to highlight what June has been involved in. And one that was just truly amazing was an artificial reality installation. It showed in 2022, and it recreated scenes from photographs. Remember, I showed you the Toy Miyatake photo at First and Central of them, boarding the buses, and so they recreated that with actors, so people from the community serving as the actors, and 3 of them. June was one of them that actually experienced boarding the buses from that site and had them costumed in 1942 costumes. And using iPads, we were able to walk among them as if we were part of it. And my mother and her parents boarded the buses there, and so it was really moving for me to be able to experience that. And another one is June has been filmed with high-tech 360 artificial intelligence technology called a story file, and shortly you'll see the hologram on the left. You'll be able to talk to June and have her answer your questions. They filmed you for several hours, right?
Yes, 3 days, 8 hours a day.
3 days. And so the trick will be to try to stump her, but you'll be able to watch this from any location around the country and around the world.
Also from your computer. Today, from your computer.
Oh, you can see it today?
Yes.
Okay.
If you download the link and you just click on the link, my picture appears, and you can ask any question. You could either verbally ask or write it down and ask your computer, like, who's your favorite trial?
Yeah.
Naturally, wrong, right?
Oh, I'm not sure I understand your question. Okay, and then there's a very important project that's going on right now, and it's called Irecho. And remember I mentioned that this was a very dehumanizing process, and for all of these years, we never actually had an accurate count of exactly who and how many individuals fell under these incarceration orders. We've been using the term 120,000 plus because no one had ever actually identified each individual with documentation that they fell into one of these detention centers. So one of my favorite colleagues and friends, Duncan Williams, a professor at USC, took on this project and created a ceremonial book with the names of everyone that we knew about up until a couple of years ago. I'm part of the research team to continue to find more names that we know are out there, and there will be a second edition of this book. But one of the ideas in Japanese culture to honor a person is to speak their name, to honor their name, and by placing a Japanese stamp by each name, we're honoring everyone who was incarcerated, whether they have family who are present now to do that for them, or be part of the community and do it so that all the names are stamped. Jews played an important part of the preparation. There's so many symbolisms in what the book is and what we want people to experience by coming and stamping the book that we could tell you about more if we have time. And one of the things that I think I've taken away from learning more about my own family history and the work on behalf of my family and all those who are also part of the incarceration story is that I come away with so much respect and admiration for my Issei grandparents, my Issei parents, the sacrifices that they made, the resilience that they showed, the dignity in their endurance. And I think as we wrap up, June would like to share some thoughts about what she's involved in the community today and what these opportunities mean for her.
I'd like to honor the late Senator Daniel, who was a good friend and also the husband of my boss, Irene Hirano, who was the first president of the Japanese American National Museum. He started out each speech that he gave with this quote from South Pacific by Oscar Hammerstein and Josh Logan. He would say, "You have got to be taught to hate. You have to be taught by the time you are 6, 7, or 8. And he said that our country, America, is the greatest country in the world. No other country has ever apologized to its citizens for a mistake that they made years ago." And he says, he will never forget that. I will never forget that. I think we have to be so careful of our freedom being taken away from us by a slight signature, by a slight vote, take away our constitutional rights. So I think we have to be vigilant. And in honor of my dear mentor and friend, Min Yasui, who watched a cockroach crawl out of his cell. And he said, the cockroach has more freedom than I do. And he said that we always have to be careful that our freedom is not taken away from us. And anytime anybody is ever threatened, if one person is threatened, we are all so much at a loss.
Well, it's been an honor for me to get to work with June to prepare for our conversation today. I just love everything about her, and it's been a delight to get to share this. And I think we have a little time for Q&A, if there might be some questions from the audience.
Introduce yourself. Before you have a question.
Ron Yamashiro, I'm the oldest son. A member of the church here. Just listening to her story, I learn something new every day. But she's just been great. But my question to you was that it was just on the West Coast that they took all the Japanese
Right.
people, right? Japanese people lived in the Midwest or on the East Coast. They were not,
Right. It was.
and it was more of a situation where because Japan was so close to us.
So it fell under the jurisdiction of Miguel. Okay, so Ron's question was that only the families on the West Coast were affected. And this is true. The Army designated the West Coast as a military zone. And so that was what gave, under Executive Order 9066, the Army the authority to remove individuals from that military zone. And so if you could move to an interior location, if you had family or friends or had some means to get in pack a car and go east, they could do that. But most families didn't have the ability to do that financially or logistically. So in addition to mentioning that they were subject to a criminal penalty, a misdemeanor, if they refused to obey, those exclusion orders stayed in effect until long after the war was over. So even after, June's family, even though the war was over and they had the ability to leave camp, they couldn't come back immediately to Los Angeles.
Thank you. So I'm friends with June, and in regard to what you were just talking about, the one thing she told me, which I thought was so powerful, you alluded to it, but it was very important when she said that much of this was also a land grab. And that's the thing people don't want to talk about. That so many farmers in California would look at the Japanese farmers or florists or whatever and realize that how much more the land was worth when they were tilling it and growing. So that's really important for, as she taught me, was that many people just wanted to steal the land or have the Japanese Americans not be able to pay their monthly fee. So I just think that's important for us to take responsibility for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my father came from a farming family, and his family had to leave standing several acres of celery ready to harvest. And even as a 14-year-old, my father knew that there were economic reasons, because at the time of the exclusion orders, when they had to leave, the price of produce of the Japanese farmers plummeted, and they couldn't afford even to plow the fields under. They just had to walk away. Of course, this was financially devastating. They got to camp, and the prices rose back up to the normal levels. So even as a 14-year-old, my father was of the opinion that it was exactly that, a land grab. He also mentioned that I didn't understand when I was younger, that he and his siblings had a very sporadic education because they had to move so frequently. They were moving every 2 years. And what I didn't know until I started doing my own education and doing this research was because of that alien land law that I told you about, that they couldn't own land, or they couldn't have a lease, and they couldn't afford to own. didn't have a lease for more than 3 years, so that's why they were always moving for 2 years.
I just wanted to ask about your kimono. Did your mother make this before you were in camp or while you were in camp?
No, this kimono came from Japan, and I had this before the war, before we went into camp. Oh, sorry. And, sorry. So, yes, it's originally made in Japan, yes, yeah, thank you. No. But in the, my AI, I do a Japanese dance.
Oh, okay, we have to see the AI, we can't see the real thing.
So if you go to the computer and say, show me your Japanese dance, then I'll dance for you.
All right. One more? Maybe we have time for one more?
I think I can speak loud. No, I just want to thank both of you ladies, and it means so much more to me to have actual people telling their stories than anything you can read. And I always appreciate these types of things. And I just want to say, say thank you to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is an extremely deeply moving experience, being introduced into the lives of Susan and Jim, and they're welcoming us into their lives the way they have today. And our church and the Malibu DAR chapter would now like to welcome you to lunch. The lunch is homemade by members of the DAR chapter and our children. There are lots of wonderful Southern cooking dishes prepared by some of our Southern raised DAR members. There are also vegan choices. So please come over and just help yourselves. And you can enjoy fellowship amongst yourselves, amongst us, and with Jim and Susan too. So thank you so much for coming.